Right, here we go. Good evening. Welcome to this month's webinar, Pace Yourself, Finding Your Groove, presented by the North American Cambridge Classics Project and sponsored by Cambridge University Press. We are so delighted to have not one, but two guest presenters this evening, Michelle Ramahlo and S.K. Smith. Michelle's been teaching Latin for 16 years to students in grades 5 through 8 in a public middle school in Chappaqua, New York. She's currently on the American Classical League Development Committee and also served with the American Classical League Board of Governors for several years. And Smith currently teaches at Riverdale Country Day School in New York City and has taught a variety of subjects in many places over the last 20 years. A combination of learning support, English, philosophy, Latin, and Greek in Chicago, St. Louis, Harlem, New Jersey, and upstate New York. She's been a very frequent presenter at our webinars and summer workshops. And both Michelle and Smith are on our NACCP board. We are recording this webinar and we will post the link on the training page of the NACCP website in just a few days. And you can find that at cambridgelatin.org. And if you need a professional development certificate for this evening's webinar, just please email us at training@cambridgelatin.org. And on that note, we will let Michelle and Smith tell us about finding your groove.
Thanks so much, Martha, and thank you to the North American Cambridge Classics Project for asking us to do this webinar. We wanted to talk a little bit about pacing in the Cambridge Latin course because there are so many stories and so many wonderful stories. And if you come to Cambridge from a textbook that doesn't have quite so many stories, it can feel almost daunting to see how you will work through all of these stories. But we have some tips and tricks that we've picked up over our years of teaching that we wanted to share with you about pacing yourself.
So we thought we would give a little taste of Stephen Krashen after our Dancing Toga Baby slide. And so one of the things that I think is particularly important when we think about pacing is really placing students at the center of the kind of work that we're doing. And when we do that, we're thinking about the best way to keep students engaged, because if you have engaged students, you're optimizing the setting for learning and a learning pace that works for everyone. So as Krashen will tell you, trust stories and the stories will help engage your students. So do you want to play just a little clip from Stephen Krashen?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
We did a study of this. Dr. Mason and I did this study a few years ago. It's in the handout. Some of the students wanted to know how good they're doing, and they wanted to take alternate forms of the TOEFL exam. Some of you know about the TOEFL. It's probably the most famous international test of English. And we then took their TOEFL scores. They shared them with us. And from their list of what they read, we could estimate how much time they put in reading over 2-3 semesters. The correlation between time spent reading and gains on the TOEFL was nearly perfect. The more they read, the more the gain. I'll give you the correlation coefficient for both of you who remember your statistics class, okay? 0.91, it was nearly perfect. Isn't this astonishing?
Smith, is that where you stop?
Yeah. So what does the TOEFL have to do with Cambridge Latin course? The very fact that instead of focusing entirely on speaking, the amount of time students have in reading is one of the biggest indicators of growth in language acquisition. And so that's what Krashen is encouraging us to do. So this happens also in Latin. The more you can get students to read and spend time really loving the stories, the better off everyone is going to be in love of Latin.
Absolutely. So what seems initially daunting becomes an area of growth for students and an opportunity for us to build students' language proficiency. So one of the things that we feel is important about pacing is sitting down and planning before you even get into the classroom. And so that could be a whole webinar in and of itself. But we definitely wanted to touch on effective planning for productive pacing. So these are some of the goals that came from this student book. And this is what the textbook says the goals of the course are.
Usually I have uh, the same kinds of things from the teacher's manual, but I think it's important also that this is also in the student book. One of my students one year pointed this out to me. She said, "Did you know that this is in the book, that this is a goal?" And I said, "As a matter of fact, I did." I was kind of excited that she had decided to read the very beginning of the book, and that she was also interested in, I'm going to learn Latin and I'm going to learn about the culture of ancient Rome. And that's what we're in the business of doing. So those two things, very simple, very straightforward, and keeping that groove going. We've got our little dancers, the Tomb of Leopards down at the bottom,
So
keeping the pace.
if these are the goals of the course and these are the goals of every single story, so when we approach these stories, we want to keep those two purposes in mind. But another thing we want to encourage you to do is to have read the stories before your students read the stories or before you get in class. And of course, you know Latin, you wouldn't be a Latin teacher without it, but having an idea in mind of how you want to approach the stories will definitely help you choose which activities you want to do with the stories, how long you want to spend on them, how much time in class you want to spend on them, and what type of analysis or blow through you want to do with the stories. Anything to add, Smith?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think our goal here is to think like the Romans did, right? The Romans were very careful, strategic planners. And if we think about what the Romans did in the setup of how to lay out a Roman city, we don't have to be as rigid or as 90-degree angled as they are. But I mean, really thinking about the layout and design is super important for efficiency.
So we recommend that you start with the teacher's manual. The teacher's manual has a wealth of information on what is contained in the stage, what stories there are. It has summaries of the stories, links to original resources, activity ideas. The teacher's manual is your absolute guide. So that's your starting point. But then you also have to consider what skills and concepts specifically you want students to learn in that particular stage or even with that particular story. So we think about our vocabulary goals. What vocabulary do we want them to acquire? And what vocabulary do we want them to acquire deeply? And what is more shallow? So when I think about stage 3, I think about Kara, wax tablet. That's not that important to me, but some of the other words in that stage are much more important. Language goals. What's the language feature in that stage? How much time do I want to spend on it? Is it going to come up again later? Yes, hint, yes. So in stage 6, I may only want to expose students to perfect tense. And in stage 7, I know perfect tense is going to be coming up even more. So I can wait to assess it later, but give them the exposure in six. What are my culture goals? How much do I want them to know about this topic? And how much do I want everyone to know about this topic versus a kid who's going to end up being a history major in the future? So thinking about what are my basic culture goals and then what are my deep dive culture goals. And then of course, there's the goals for the driving the plot and the storyline forward. This is a connected storyline from stage 1 to the end. The whole storyline flows throughout. And sometimes we want to make sure that we've seen a story that sets up something else in the future. And so the children's motivation quite often is the plot. Our motivation may be different as teachers, but the children just want to know what happens next. Then we have our ACL standards or our ACTFL standards or our state goals or our province goals and the 5 C's: communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, and communities. So an effective plan, having thought about what's in the stage, inventoried what resources you have, and considering your goals will help set the stage for success throughout that stage. And just the screenshot here is my colleague and I went through stage 13 and we thought about what videos do we have, what activities are in the omnibus and in the, what's that thing called? The other helping book. I can't remember the name of it right now.
The activity masters.
Yeah, the activity masters. Sorry, my brain, I was like, ancillary? No. The activity masters. And we just listed it out so we know what we had. And that inventorying paid off for future us. So once we had the list forever. And now we know exactly what's in there and exactly what we have. And when we sit down to plan stage 13, we know what we've got right away. So a plan, it pays dividends for future you.
Thinking along the same lines of the planning, as we are thinking about planning for our students, we also want to be thinking about how in line we are with our colleagues, with our, as Michelle mentioned before, with ACTFL, with the 5Cs, and I included state and province for our Canadian friends because our Canadian friends have some really great ideas. If you click on the ACL standards, this document that everyone has seen before that says draft, it only says draft because it's still a working document, but this is something that everyone should definitely be familiar with, and it walks through the 5Cs in detail. Unless you think this is not something that you should be interested in, even fancy schmancy universities like Harvard have this linked to their language site. So you can click on Harvard's classical language site, and this draft is on their website. And the same thing is true, the kind of shorthand 5Cs. It's basically the document that gives you kind of a down and dirty of how everything is aligned through the standards in that way. It's really good to think about what each of these, how you're hitting each of these as you plan so that you can keep the pace moving. And if you aren't doing those things, you're definitely missing something overall within your classroom. And it's a good reminder to take a look at what you need. I've linked my own set of standards so you can see I have both measurable and unmeasurable goals every year. And for me, the heart of it is number 3, the reading comprehension and analysis. It's all about reading. So vocabulary funnels into reading, language funnels into reading, Roman perspective, art and culture funnel back in. So all of those things are at the service of reading comprehension. Almost some. Okay. When I first heard this at Cambridge, I don't think I quite understood what it was. I kept hearing it repeated and I was like, okay, what is this? Is this like ABC? Almost some. It's really not a great way to think about it. What you do want is, if you want to keep an effective pace in your classroom, what does everybody in your classroom need to take away as you get through a story or a stage? What should everybody get through at the end of Unit 1 or at the end of Unit 2? And if you think about it that way, I think it becomes a much more doable, effective planning strategy for making sure that the pace keeps going. Michelle, did you want to add anything?
Only that, I mean, if you think about the composition of students in your classroom, they're coming to you with diverse backgrounds, diverse interests, different learning styles. And so we may want some kids to memorize all the macrons on every ending, but that may not be realistic for all students. So what we want all students to be able to do is to go back to that original goal. I can read Latin to understand a story. That's what all students should be able to do. And then most will be more interested in certain aspects of culture or grammar, and even fewer in other things. So they're, you know, we're not training necessarily our future Latin teachers, all of them in the room, but some of them might be. So we just think about the different learning styles of students, but we have a sort of a base level of what we want everyone to be able to do.
So if you go on to this slide, you'll see an example from stage 15 about everyone in stage 15 by the end of stage 15 should know who Salvius and Quintus are. That's a pretty basic expectation. It's not that you have low expectations or that you don't feel in any way that students aren't capable of rising above it, but you have some ground rules set for when we talk about these stories, we need to know who the characters are. Should know about Dumnorix and his function. Most of the students should know Dumnorix has a history of winning based upon the stories that they've read. You might have a couple of students who missed that really important moment. It doesn't mean that you can't cycle back and review those things. And then some of the students might have a more nuanced understanding of the relationships between Salvius and Dumnorix and Quintus, etc. So again, it doesn't mean that not everyone is going to get that by the end of the book, but that everyone at the end of stage 15 should definitely have some core understandings of what's happening in these stories and who the characters are.
That's a great way of putting it. And I also think we're not talking about lowering expectations. We're just talking about knowing the kids who are in the room. So while planning is a huge and important part of how we set up ourselves for success and knowing what we want our goals to be and knowing what we want our students to do, we also have some strategies for what happens when we actually get into the classroom. So a lot of research about reading talks about how important pre-reading is, not just the moment where you sit down with the text, but what we set up in place for students to be successful when they sit down with texts. And so, in my opinion, just working with, you know, elementary to middle school students, the pre-reading strategies are not skippable. They're so important to class structure, to the success of the students in reading, and they set the tone that we are starting class working. It doesn't have to be, you know, translate. We can do really fun stuff at the beginning of class, but everything that we're doing is helping us to be able to understand the reading that we're going to be doing for the bulk of class. So we gave some examples of just some of the possible pre-reading strategies, like reading the model sentences, or if you've already read them, projecting them and looking at them again, previewing vocabulary or language structures that'll show up in the text, looking at the stage pictures or other illustrations that would accompany a text or help students understand the text or help students understand the culture in the text, or even to make predictions based on some of the vocabulary.
So what does all of this have to do with pacing? The more you plan, the better engaged your students will be when you're prepared to go through material, to activate, to connect, to get them excited about what to look for in the story so they feel ownership over the stories by the time they're reading the story in full. So if you do pre-reading and then you read the story and then you do post-reading, you're often seeing that story at least 3 times. And so you're looking for ways to reread, pre-read, read, reread, you've got them.
Exactly. So one of the most important things we can do for our students is to help activate their own background knowledge or provide some cultural information for them of what they're going to encounter in the stage. Students often don't have a kind of historical knowledge, especially when they're as young as, like, I have 5th grade students. They don't know very much about the ancient world. It actually hasn't come up yet. And in New York State, the ancient world is 6th grade social studies. So by the time they're in 5th grade, they really haven't learned anything about the ancient world unless they're just interested in it. So giving them some background knowledge or activating what they think about the cultural topic of the stage can really help them understand what's happening in the stories. Here's an example from Tumultus 2. We asked students to just think about what they might already know about Alexandria, the city of Alexandria. Have they even heard of it? Some of them haven't. Have they heard of Alexander the Great? Have they heard of Cleopatra? Have they heard of the lighthouse? So they just talk about what they've heard and what they might know, and then you can clear up misconceptions. You know, when we did this activity in class, a student said that Cleopatra built the pyramids. So they didn't, you know, and like that's okay, right? They don't know that yet. They just know Cleopatra, something about Egypt. They don't really know the nuances, but they cannot understand the stories in Tumultus 1 and 2 in stage 17 about the tensions in Alexandria without knowing a little bit. And so having them activate their background knowledge allowed me to clear up misconceptions, but also set the stage for their success in reading that story.
Okay, here's a very classic example of why you should never, ever, ever skip the model sentences. And even when you have a stage without model sentences. I have been known to make my own model sentences because I love them so much, and I think that they're essential for setting the stage for literally setting the stage for everything else that we're going to be reading. If you would click on the picture, Michelle, I'll just show you an example. There are a variety of ways that you can go through the model sentences. When I first go through the model sentences and we introduce everyone in the family, and we talk about the picture, and then we do a little review, and I'll point to Homer and I'll say, Quis est, who is this guy? And they'll say, Pater. And I'll point to Marge and I'll say, Quis est? And they'll say mater. And so you can go through a host of these. Slide 3 has canis, and you've got infans and filius and filia, and you've got coqua in the Brady Bunch. And so you can play around with it. And it's just a very easy way to play around with vocabulary, also culture, as they've just started their entry into Latin. So this is all day one. With the model sentences and playing around. It doesn't take long and it's super exciting. And the students leave the class and they feel a great deal of ownership because here they are speaking, learning, reading Latin on day one.
Super. The model sentences are also crucial to help students build a mental picture of what these characters might be like. And so when they're reading, they're making pictures in their heads, just like we do when we read in English, of what this family might be like. And here's the pictures. The book gives it to us. We also find it super important to preview new vocabulary, maybe vocabulary that's glossed in the story, that's not stage vocabulary, but is going to be used a lot in the story, unknown vocabulary, or even language features that are going to come up in that stage reading, so that when they see it, they've encountered it before and they've heard it before, and they can make sense of it when they see it in the reading. So in the story Ad Aulam, they're proceeding to King Cargadubnus's palace, and there's words in there that are not stage words, but they do need to know them, the word plaustrum. And so this is the do now for class that day. We're going to read the story Ad Aulam. I asked the students to just guess what they think those words mean. They've seen an image, they've connected the image to their mind, and then they also have in their notebook a little mini dictionary of the words that are going to be used in that story. Augment is a stage word and impedit is a stage word, but the other words aren't, but they're still important. So just previewing for the students what they're going to see in their story helps them understand the story even better.
I think this activity is also really wonderful in having students make a mini story in their head. Here are 6 Latin words with some pictures. What do you predict is going to happen? And sometimes they're spot on, and sometimes their predictions are wildly funny and outrageous and lead to wonderful discussions about what really happens in the story and what they think should happen.
That's true, Smith. And actually, what's funny is, you give this to students as a do now, and you don't necessarily ask them to predict, but they just do it naturally. They sit down and they like, what's going to happen with a wagon throwing in a ditch? And then they go, well, somebody's going to throw a wagon in a ditch. Well, guess what? That's what happens. And it's okay. And it's not giving anything away. They're still surprised when they read it. It's just helping them to make sense of it when they get there. Another this is previewing a language feature. So in Controversia, they have this debate about, who's better, the Romans or the Greeks. And we do a series of do nows building up to that. Who's better? And we use an Avenger, to compare Thor or Captain America. And they have very, strong opinions about this. You could do, which is better, buffalo wings or nachos? Which is better, a loyal friend or a rich friend? There's so many prompts out there. And in fact, while I don't always advocate for AI is really good at coming up with prompts about which is better than what. If you're running out of ideas, like what would a Miller schooler think? I don't know. So I ask them to write Quis est melior, Thor or Captain America. They have to say, and then when we read it in the stories, they've already heard something est melior quam something over and over, and it makes it just easier to understand.
I think that this is lovely, not only with connecting to their own personal interests, but also a sneaky way to get sentence patterns in without them realizing it, that they're putting it into practice, that they're seeing the dreaded like positive, comparative, superlative without ever having to name positive, comparative, and superlative adjectives. They get it. They get it because it's personal to them and because of the repetition.
So sometimes we just want to build anticipation. What exciting thing is going to happen in this story? We whet their appetite to be excited for reading rather than feeling like, oh, my sister's making me read this. They think, oh, I'm so excited to find out what is happening in this story. So in stage 16, Rex Spectaculum Dot, this old friend word cloud, people don't use those anymore. This is an old image, but here's some words from the story. What do you think Bellimicus's plan might be? And if they can't write it in Latin, this is not necessarily about writing in Latin. It's just about thinking about what could happen. And here's the words there to use. So these are stage words, except for Ursa. So they know them. And then they just predict, and it gets them excited to see if their prediction comes true. You can even have kids vote on, you write down their predictions and see which one actually came true or which one they think will come true. So it really whets their appetite for reading what happens next.
I think also the size of the word sometimes is how frequently that word appears in a text.
I believe that's what this is. Yeah. Oops, sorry.
No, that's fine. I think it's fun for kids to see like, oh, there's a bear, and that bear is really going to feature largely in this story. And what the heck is going to happen? Who's making fun of the bear? Are the bears making fun of people? So I love that kind of wordplay. Okay, when I was at the Globe Theater for summer, I did all sorts of theater and drama activities, which I think are completely applicable to Latin, English, history, whatever class you happen to be teaching. But Cambridge Latin course, you can use your model sentences, you can pull out words that you think are standout words in a particular story. And all you do is you have students, if you have a really big class, you can split the groups up into a couple of circles. You could do one big circle if you want, if you feel like you have better control over it, if you have a small group. They just stand. It's important that they, in their circles, make eye contact with one another before they toss something to another person, some little beanbag, something soft. You could also not toss anything and just toss with your eyes, or say the person's name. So you establish eye contact, you say the person's name, and then you say the word in Latin. And it goes around the circle a few times, faster and faster. And some of the kids love their words, and it gets silly and fun. And it just takes a few minutes. It gets the crazies out before they can sit down. And then when they get to read their story, they're like, oh, it's my word, it's my word. And they take such ownership over their word or phrase. They're so excited about it. It doesn't take a lot of time. You maintain the pace. It is a pre-reading strategy. They own the word, they're engaged. You move on straight into the story.
Love it. I can totally see my fifth graders being into this. Finally, similar to what we did with the Captain America idea, we want to connect what we're reading in our Cambridge stories to kids' own lives. Every one of these stories features human beings, and the Romans, they're just like us. They fall in love, they get angry, they fight, they're jealous, they save people, they hurt people. And so we want to connect the stories to the children's lives as much as we possibly can.
Before you move from that slide, I'm sorry that it says, I mean, it is an image on a sarcophagus, but it's such a sweet little image. So like there's kind of a little morbidity with the picture, but in order to cite it appropriately, it's a quite charming little piece.
Mm. So in stage 14, Rufilla and Sawius have been arguing and arguing and arguing, and then Quintus shows up and steps right into the middle of this argument. And so the children have already read the stories where Sawius and Rufilla are arguing, but then they haven't read the one where Quintus shows up yet. So I ask them at the beginning of class, think about a time when you were having a fight or tension with a family member, like you're fighting with one of your siblings, or your mom tells you you can't play video games anymore, and all of a sudden a friend shows up or a guest comes over. Or think about a time where you went over to someone's house and they were having that happen. What was that like? Or what do you imagine it would feel like if you haven't felt that way? And so the students are primed to think about, oh, that's so awkward when you walk in there and you can feel the tension in the air and you feel weird. And it kind of helps them understand like why Quintus doesn't say very much in that story and how Rufilla and Sawius are sort of fighting with each other still, but kind of through Quintus, and it just lets them understand the subtleties and nuances of what's happening. They're processing and making sense of the Latin, but then there's the human element and part of that story as well. So just asking them to think about something that feels the same as something they will encounter in a story helps them connect it to their own lives.
It's a great way not only to build empathy, but it's also a wonderful opportunity to dig more deeply into character analysis. So if you're looking at ways for kids to understand why a character does what a character does, start with a way that you can connect to them. It really does help.
So these are all pre-reading strategies. They would take about 5 or 10 minutes at the start of class. And my classes are 55 minutes, or in a 40-minute class, that time is time well spent because it sets the students up for success for the main bulk of class, which is the reading that we are so lucky to have in the Cambridge Latin course. So we're moving away now from the pre-reading strategies and into kind of the reading and reading with a purpose. So as we said earlier, reading can have many purposes for our Latin courses. Sometimes the purpose is to deepen our understanding of the characters. Sometimes it's to further the storyline and the plot line of Quintus's hero arc, or Salius's heel turn. Often those two things go hand in hand. We're also building students' vocabulary. The more they see a word, the more they know it. We're deepening their understanding of Roman culture. And of course, we want to make sure that they are exposed to and have seen the language features that are the key parts of the stages, and they get that exposure through the readings.
I also wanted to point out storyline first, language features last. Like in whatever order you want to put the characters, the vocabulary, the culture, but storyline first, language features last. Like really get the kids to focus on the stories. They'll
Right.
get the language features.
I feel like we sometimes come to these stories thinking that the point of the story is to practice the language feature. And the point of the story is to read Latin, not to practice the language feature. Practicing the language feature is a lovely side effect of reading all of this Latin, but it's not the goal of reading Latin. The goal of reading Latin is to read Latin. So, it's not a setup to practice the millions of practice sentences that happen later. That's not what the point of the reading is. So, and we want to make sure that, we don't have to say that out loud to the children, but when we come from a Wheelock or we come from an S.K, we're thinking about things in a little bit of a different way. And that's not how this course is meant to be set up. Oops, sorry, my bad. So when we approach a story, I kind of keep these things in mind. So there's very many stories in a stage. So my first thought is, what serves the story and your students? Some stories are great for acting, and some kids love acting, but not all stories are good for acting. So maybe I want to act this story, but maybe I don't. And the next thing I'm thinking about is, did I act the previous story? Then I don't want to act the next one. I want to try something new and different than what I did in the previous story. If I translated the first story in the stage, I don't necessarily want to translate the second story in the stage. I might want to do it differently. I also think about what that particular story will accomplish. Is it a story that's super easy and we can do it really fast, or is it one that requires a lot of analysis? Which also brings me to, what supports do students need to understand this story? We'll talk about examples later of supports that we provide to our students, but what materials do I have in the activity masters? Are there illustrations already provided? What supports am I going to need to provide versus what students will need? And then what are my resources and constraints? Do I have time for this? Am I rushing? Is it the end of the quarter? We, both of us, very strongly recommend that instead of skipping any story, you skim it. And we're going to provide some ways to skim things quickly without losing that important plot, storyline, character, and vocabulary.
So what you're going to see in the next few examples are a host of ways that you can approach a story, and we've kind of grouped them up: long stories, short stories, medium stories. So just looking at the lines, that's the first thing I think a lot of Latin teachers and students do when you approach a story. You're like, oh my gosh, this is 40 lines. This is going to take me 3 days to get through. Nope, you can do it in one class period, and you can do that whole story with pre-reading, reading, and post-reading strategies. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? It's not like we're looking at a child's magnum opus and saying, "Da-da, I've got this story and I understand everything about it." Great if they do, great if you do, but I know that that's not how I read everything. My first pass through a lot of material means sometimes I just need to take a quick cursory look through it, and sometimes I need to look more deeply. As we go through these, sometimes you'll see a short story and you can move quickly through it. Sometimes that short story really needs a lot of digging to unpack character relationships or the culture or tensions or connections from previous stories. Do you want to go ahead, Michelle, or I'm happy to?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so for me, everything is about balance. The very first thing you always want to be able to articulate is, what do you want to get out of this story? What are your learning objectives? What are the skills that you want kids to take away from the story? What do you want them to get excited about? What do you want them to get frustrated about? What do you want them to challenge? Take a look at how long or short the story is, and then consider all of those things: the story, the characters, the vocab, the culture, and the language features. How do all of those things connect to the 5 Cs? And if you cannot name all of the 5 Cs, you should be starting to think about how you can, because in your head, you should be thinking just beyond communication, right? You should be thinking about, how do I connect to communities? How do I make connections within a story? And then at the very end, you should be thinking, as you're planning your pace for the reading of the story, what do I want every kid to take away? What do I want most kids to take away? What do I want some of the kids to take away from this first pass through? Okay, so In Itinere is a really short 13-line story. Like, this is it. This is the whole story. And you can spend a lot of time on it, or you can just zip right through. When you start stage 24, there are no model sentences. You hop right into the story. I like to do kind of my own model sentences. So I do a line toss. So what we talked about a little bit earlier, where I pull maybe a couple of words or phrases out. Definitely something about the horse, a bridge. Someone always wants to say "couty case," right? Like, who doesn't want to yell "blockheads" in a circle where you're talking back and forth to your friends? And when that word shows up, boy, do they remember it, right? Blockhead, tree stump, however you want to translate it. And then I do a 9-panel storyboard, and I move quite quickly through it. So the next couple of slides will show you what that looks like. So I've just chunked up the text. I have little speech bubbles. So Modestus is the one speaking, and what might he be saying? Whatever they put in the speech bubbles. Some kids want to put Latin, some kids want to put English. Sometimes they'll put squiggly marks because they're cursing someone out. That's okay too. Sometimes they'll treat it as a thought bubble. There is no right or wrong. But if you want to keep pace, I often will read aloud with a lot of vim and vigor, a lot of expression, and I'll read it a couple of times, and I will tell the students 30 seconds or 45 seconds. And I say, this is not a fantastic artistic work. Stick figures are great. Get to the heart of the scene, and then move on. And I'm just constantly going around the room, double checking the students' work, putting little emojis next to things that I think are particularly funny. But you can move through this very quickly. It's just 9 pictures, 9 stick figure pictures that you're asking kids to do, to visualize a text so that they have a very clear idea about what is happening, to whom, where, when, why, etc. And then you can go through and do whatever kinds of language features you want. You can have them identify subjunctives if that's something. You can hold off and do that later. It doesn't matter, but the crux of it is, like, Modestus and Strithio are super funny, and so get to the heart of why these two are such comical characters. And then I put a post-reading activity called CAPT, which we'll talk about a little bit later in post-reading strategies.
Super. Just to complement this activity, the storyboards are great ways of helping students visualize, and they work really quickly. But more importantly, they're helping students access the text. When you look at this big block of text, it can be intimidating. And at this point, students are in Latin 2 or 3. So they're probably able to read fairly well, but still a big blocks of text can still be intimidating. And Smith has chunked it into meaning units. So now they're in little units of meaning. It's just more accessible to the students. So it's a support that students can access that will help all students. This is a great, great, great activity. Pays off a lot. But if you storyboarded the story, the first story, you don't necessarily want to storyboard the story after that. So you're keeping also in your mind, how often do I employ this strategy? Do I do it every single stage? Maybe give it a rest if you do it all the time. So another story we wanted to talk about going through quickly is the story Tremores, which is the first story in stage 12. Stage 12, we talked about acting. You don't really want to act people dying in a volcano. That feels off, right? So like when we think about acting in the stories, having lots of acting opportunities, my students love to act, but I'm not going to act out things like enslavement or death. It just doesn't feel right to me. So we don't act anything in stage 12, and this story is kind of a setup story for the other stories. He's over at Julius's house. Clemens comes to get him and bring him back to the city. So I don't feel like the story needs a lot of in-depth analysis. I want my students to go through it fairly quickly. So like Smith did, I take the story, break it up into smaller chunks on a Google slideshow. I give them some picture support and I ask them just to summarize what happened on that page. I'm not asking for a translation. I just want to know that they mostly understand that Caecilius is over at Julius's house, but he's outside the city. That's what's important about that. For the pre-reading, we've reviewed the vocab that has from the model sentences that has the words in here, like terra tremuit. I just want them to get the plot quickly. I want them to have further exposure to first and second person perfect, but I'm really not asking them to translate at this point. And then I want them to predict, as our post-reading strategy, what has Clemens come to say, which then sets us up for our next activity. This is quick, this is easy, it has picture support, it is not too taxing, and it also, again, breaks the story up into unit meaning chunks. I just retyped the text onto a slideshow. So it's helpful to the kids and we get through it really fast.
Okay, so this is our Romeo and Juliet story, the day before the wedding, Praedia Nuptiatum. And so I almost always show Romeo and Juliet trailer, often the one with Leonardo DiCaprio. My students swoon over that little trailer and they want to see it again and again. So it sets what happens up between Paula and Helvidius, and when they approach the story. And because this is a 41-line story, I don't want them to think, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get through this. So I'll do, for example, one part will be a cloze, C-L-O-Z-E exercise. I pull out words that I know that they might be having trouble with. So it becomes, if you see off to the left, I've highlighted what each of the skills I want kids to pay attention to. So it says cloze exercise 1A vocabulary. So with this section, I really want kids to pay attention to vocabulary that they might not be getting. And by the way, once all of this has been translated and they read through it, they have a very clear idea about what has happened in the story, who the characters are, and what's going to happen next. So this is part one of the story. The second part, I often call this the kitchen sink approach to pacing, because I'll do a cloze exercise for part of a story. The next part on the next slide are just comprehension and analysis questions, which you can do either in English or in Latin. And I try to break things up pretty clearly. So if I ask for 3 things, I'm going to give an A, B, and C reminder to students who forget, oh, well, I put an answer down. Oh, I need 3 answers down. I will always have students who skip a couple of things if I don't make a marker of those. And then the last part is a swanky cool translation. What I mean by that is not that you do a literal translation of every single word. The students pair up. So you've got maybe 3 kids working together on this little section of text. And they're all working together on it at the same time. And I say, the world's your oyster, do with it as you like. You can write this as if Helvidius and Paula are texting one another. And you've got like somebody kind of from the outside world, zooming in and interrupting their texting conversation. You can do like a Beyonce Texas Hold'em style if you want to make it like countrified, but also have a little like Beyonce swag to it. So really just let them have fun with it. They will surprise you with the joy that they bring to it, and they love it. And it's an opportunity for you to see how clearly and carefully they are getting the story without demanding, with a first pass through, a first read through, that everything is perfect. And I think we need to give ourselves and our kids the grace to go through a story and be able to play around with language. That's why language is so fun. That's why I decided to teach Latin. I think that opportunity to play is central. And then as an extension activity, the post reading, you can say, okay, now write your own scene. And it can be as short as like 2 or 3 lines, like what will happen? Or you can do a little summary of dun, dun, dun. What do you think is going to happen next? And then they're super excited. I've had some kids who say, I know you told me not to read ahead, but I read ahead. And that's the best part ever. It's like, good. I'm so glad you didn't listen.
Exactly. And with all these different activities, you're hitting all different kinds of students. Some students will love this acting out, creating their own flavor, and some will prefer to the straightforward answering of questions, and some will really love the close and not having to translate every single word, but only the words that are super crucial. So you're hitting all kinds of students with all of these activities, and they're spending time in the language, which is the most important thing that we want for them. So another long story that requires, I think, close reading is my favorite deck ends. So we just wanted to show that, um, you know, that in this particular case, I feel like the story, because it has a frame story, people telling stories within a story, it requires really close reading. And so for the students to understand it, they either need to be answering some questions or even doing some translating. And so the goal is for them to understand it, but going through it quickly or acting it out isn't going to get them that level of understanding, because there's just so much complexity in this story. So, over on the right, you'll see that there's areas where I've given them the vocabulary. I took the activity masters, why can I not remember that name, and pasted it into the document so that it's clear, and then they're answering a question right below this. So this is adapted from an original thing that was in the activity masters, but I just beefed it up a little bit because I wanted to make students able to type, number one, honestly, but to make it super duper clear and add my own questions into that. So before we read this story, we just summarize the one before it, which we did act out. And so we've acted the previous story. We have the frame story of deck ends, and now we're doing some really close reading. And the extension after this is for students to investigate what they think really did happen to deck ends. Do they believe Metella's theory? Do they believe these Serwi? And so we're really just focusing on close analysis for plot purposes. But of course, all the way along, they're reading things in the perfect tense. They're getting exposure to the perfect tense. They're seeing it throughout and becoming more and more comfortable with the perfect tense.
And if you're a fan of Petronius and you end up teaching Petronius, use these adapted stories that are based on so much of Petronius Satyricon, or any of the Cambridge stories that are adapted from the larger text, because it's a wonderful blast from the past when you have upper level students reading Virgil or Ovid or Catullus, and you're like, oh, right, I remember this. And they get such good feels from these stories, and they understand why the characters are behaving as they do in a more complicated bit of Latin. Okay, post-reading strategies. So I put post-reading strategies actually after each section of Pretty Notarium, because I thought maybe sometimes you go through a little section and you just want a little kind of wrap up, like we did some pre-reading, we did some reading, let's go back and reread. You can do that per chunk if you want, or you can do it over the whole thing. The beautiful thing about Cambridge is that everything spirals. So You see it once, you see it again, you see it a third time. If a student doesn't get it the first 10 times, they might get it the 11th. They might get it at the end of the text. And that's the luxury, I think, of language teaching. It's not these segmented insular units where a child is exposed to something and then they don't see it again. So I think everyone's familiar with doing some kind of summarization. I'm going to show you a couple of other ways of summarizing or thinking about summarizing and reflecting that you might not consider as summarizing and reflecting. So those are also necessary skills that kids need and how they work.
Great. And I think also, we think, okay, we read the story, I'm done, that's it. We don't have to revisit it, but it's a crucial and important step in students understanding and then their brains to stop and pause and think about what they've read. It helps them understand it better. And what's interesting too is that, talking about things coming up later for students, every once in a while they'll be like, wait a minute, wait, was that the guy that was in stage 2? Or like, is Hermogenes going to come back again? They love Hermogenes. I don't know why. So they're thinking about these characters still, even units and units later, partially because they've had the opportunity to reflect on them and think about them at the end of the reading.
So this can be considered a summarization activity. It could be a reflection activity. It's called CAPT, C-A-P-T. It stands for character, author style, plot, and theme. And you're just looking at positive and negative words about the character or about the plot or about the theme. And so this is from Kylene Beer. She's got a book called When Kids Can't Read, which is a really great book for any student, not just struggling readers, but kids who are bored or kids who check out because they feel like they are grade locked in some way and they can't move ahead. They're just concrete ways of going back and looking at the story and giving you an opportunity to summarize what just happened. And it doesn't take long. I mean, it's like exit slip fast.
This is excellent. Also, when students disagree about certain words or certain people, it really gives an opportunity to dig deep into backing up their thoughts with evidence from the text.
The next one is tea party. I always want to call it cocktail party, but we teach in schools, so it's tea. And so Kylene Beers suggests the same kind of thing as the line toss, only students move around and it looks a little bit chaotic. You can do this as a pre-reading strategy or a post-reading strategy. Same thing where you give students little slips of paper or words on index cards, and I say a word or a phrase, and I teach it to Michelle, and then Michelle teaches her word or phrase to me, and then we go off in different directions. We've had our tea, and now we go over and we say, hey, Nora, I'd like to teach you my new word or my phrase. And so I tell it to you in Latin, and you try to say what you think it is. And so we try to get as many contact points across the room as possible so that students are hearing different words and phrases. And when they do that, and this is after they've read the sentence, they're like, oh yeah, I remember this, right? So if you're doing it as a pre-reading strategy, they've never seen it before. If they're doing it as a post-reading strategy, you can have them come up with their own favorite word or phrase, and then wander around the room. And then one of my favorite things to do, you can do a found poem, but the other thing I really like to do is called a pointing exercise. And it's basically like Quaker Meeting House. I shut off the lights. It's nice and quiet. It kind of calms kids down. And they take the word or phrase that they really love. And the only rule is no two people can talk at the same time. So if I start talking and then Jenny pipes up, then Jenny knows that she's going to wait until I finish saying my word or phrase, and then Jenny says hers, and then Martha comes in, etc. So everyone has a chance to voice their word or phrase. It's very low stakes, but it's also a good reminder. You can say the same word 3 times, and that's really powerful too, because it lets you know, okay, what does this say about the mood of the story? Where is this taking us? How do you feel about direction that the characters are headed?
Super. I love these ideas. Obviously, writing is a post-reading strategy. Sometimes we ask students to write a new ending of a story. What could have happened in the Felix story or something in Latin, or a mix of Latin and English if we're not worried about too much about them writing a lot in Latin, or write the story that would happen after this one, or even summarize in Latin the story that you just read. All of those are powerful and important post-reading strategies that involve writing.
Okay, so checking in again. What does all this have to do with pace? How do you keep kids on target, moving? How do you make sure your course is moving? Plan, 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 get students engaged, trust the stories, and know that the more you plan, the more you know the stories, the more that you're thinking about what kids need, what you like, what the kids enjoy, the more that you're going to be able to pick up the pace, keep that momentum going, and get through material, but rather kind of pushing through. It's about discovering things along the way.
Exactly.
So how do you know if your pacing is right? If you're moving too slowly, you're likely to have chaos on your hands, snowball fights. If you're going too quickly, you and your kids are going to be pulling their hair out, and we definitely want a Goldilocks situation where it's just right. And the more that you can think about how you've articulated the skills that you want your kids to have from each of the stories, they will trust you as much as they trust the stories. They will trust the process, and they will be excited on the journey to learn with you.
Exactly. And also just to say, we don't know how long people in our group, in our webinar here, have been teaching, but it takes a few years to get it right. You have to play around and experiment before you really know how long it's going to take you to get through X, Y, and Z. And then you'll know, I can spend this long on this story. I want to make sure I fly through this story. It just comes a lot with experiment. So you play around with it, do as much as you can, and play around with different ways of working with stories and see what works best for you.
And so you end up with your very messy Goldilocks, and be graceful to yourself. I think we're often unduly harsh when we don't feel like we've gotten something right. And I think we need to be able to take risks ourselves in the same way that we ask students to take risks.
A really great point.
Very well said. Really well done. And thank you to you both. You had so many excellent points that I hope everybody can take home something from this. And I especially liked that concentrate on the story first and the characters, and then language last. And as Michelle just summed it up, a lot of it has to do with experience, how many years you've been doing this and how familiar you yourself are as a teacher with these stories. And yeah.
And I was going to say, I liked particularly your point about the student's goal is to find out what's happening in the stories. You as the teacher may be wrapped up in other goals, both by external requirements on you and your own training. And to keep in mind that you're coming at it from two different places is very healthy, I think. Yeah. I think you guys did a fabulous job.
Yeah.
Thank you. I did want to share one other thing, which is that we have listed the stories here that we think are really great for acting. And we also
Wonderful.
indicated whether there is a movie for that story. So we wrote out all of the stages, which the stories we think are good for acting, and then we wrote down which movies exist for Unit 1 and 2 so that you know in your own inventory what you have and what you can work with. We also
That's
linked
very helpful.
here that people can use to help plan with. And hopefully we'll be able to talk about some of this more in the summer workshops.
And we've pasted a copy of the slideshow for you if you'd like to grab the link and take a look at it. And if any of those resources are more helpful for you to take a look at your own time.
Great. Thank you so very much. And as I said earlier, we will post this webinar on the cambridgelatin.org website in just a few days. So you'll have the audio to go with it as well. Does anybody have a question before we finish this evening?
Almost some concept. I really appreciate that because I think I'm always aiming for everyone to have perfect comprehension in everything, every single person, every single time. And so it's just really helpful to realize that